Here's a bit of trivia. In 1976, a case known as Buckley vs. Vallejo was brought to the Supreme Court, wherein the Supreme Court struck down limits on independent expenditures and gave rise to the idea that spending money for political campaign purposes is a form of speech. And this is not the only time they resorted to this idea. In 2010, as a result of Citizens United versus the FEC, the Supreme Court voted 5-4 in favor of allowing labor unions, non-profit corporations, and for-profit corporations to spend as much as they want on elections. Once again, the argument that they used to justify this was that corporations have a First Amendment right to spend as much money as they want to influence the outcome of an election. Or to put it a simpler way, money equals speech. Bear in mind, what you're looking at here is the argument in a nutshell. The Supreme Court didn't argue that money and speech are the same darn thing in all circumstances. The argument is, since we live in a democracy, and since you need a lot of money to maintain a political campaign capable of giving you a winning chance, giving your money to a political campaign is just as good as expressing with your words that you want a particular candidate to win. It's the kind of idea that requires a wink and a nod, but in theory, this argument isn't all that bad. Let's say that a politician is running for an office. Now let's say, just for the sake of argument, that you and this candidate agree on every single issue. You want this person to win the race and be elected. Yes, you can give this candidate your vote, but before that ever happens, they need to campaign. To run a campaign, they need money, and you're all too willing to give some of yours to them. This is where the cheeky concept of money equaling speech arrives. Hey, we're allowed to speak as much as we want to help someone get into office. Why not give money the same treatment? Whichever candidate has the best message, whoever attracts the most support for their positions, the more people will want to give their money to their campaign. And why shouldn't they be allowed to? It's their money! This is the concept of money equals speech, and again, in theory, it works. Unfortunately, not every idea that works in theory works just as well in practice. Take the following into consideration. In the real world, some people have a lot more money than your average American. A lot more money. Hold that thought while we move on to another fun fact. In the real world, the candidate that gets the most money is almost guaranteed to win. Let's take Congress, for example. 93% of House of Representatives seats and 94% of Senate seats go to the candidate that raises the most money. The statistics for the presidency are different, but it's still the case that a majority of the time, the candidate that raises the most money wins. Now, let's put these two thoughts together. These people with a lot more money than your average American know that the candidate with the most money is most likely to win the race. And what's more important, the candidates themselves know this too. So let's say that a very wealthy American, again, just for the sake of argument, agrees with a candidate on every single issue except for one. Well, with wealth comes power, and this wealthy person might try to use that power to change this candidate's policy on that issue. How, you ask? They tell that candidate that they will give them enough money to outspend every other candidate in the race, giving them a much better chance of winning, if and only if they change their position on that one particular issue. If you were this candidate and you wanted to win the race, what would you do? Refusing the deal and sticking to your principles may prove to be futile. That billionaire would likely just find another candidate who would be willing to roll over on their positions for a chance to outspend every other candidate. Then that person would likely win and you would lose. And what a shame that would be. The candidate that will say anything, do anything, support anything, flip-flop any day of the week, that candidate would have a better chance of winning, while the candidate that sticks to what they believe would be more likely to lose. All because they didn't take this wealthy person's money. If you think this is bad, this is just the basics. Suppose a second billionaire who disagrees politically with the first billionaire starts bribing a second politician, and they start changing all of their positions around so that their campaign can get all of the second billionaire's money. By this point, the election has been completely degraded and is no longer a marketplace of the candidate's ideas. It's just a spending war between political donors. This would make the United States of America, by definition, an oligarchy, a small group of people having control of a country. Suffice to say, this is a far cry from the democracy that the United States is supposed to be. Elected representatives are supposed to, represent the population. But if their main concern becomes to get as much money as possible so that they can get reelected, they're likely going to answer only to Americans who have the most money, thus alienating the majority of the American people and whatever they want. This isn't to say that the majority of the population never get what they want. They do, but not often enough. Here's an example. After the Sandy Hook Elementary School massacre, where 20 children and 6 teachers were murdered, a bill was proposed in Congress requiring a background check of anyone who wanted to purchase a firearm. It was a very popular bill. Over 90% of the country wanted it to pass, but it didn't. The bill was struck down in the Senate by senators who had been giving campaign contributions from the National Rifle Association. There are plenty of other examples of this. 80% of Americans want to raise the minimum wage and chain it to inflation, yet no bills have been passed to accomplish this. How about drugs? 63% want to end mandatory minimums and 54% want to legalize marijuana, yet the war on drugs has not been brought to an end. And while we're at it, war. Only 15% of Americans want to be involved in Iraq, and yet American troops are still there. This is not how a democracy is supposed to function. However, this is how an oligarchy functions. A government of, by, and for the rich. CEOs don't want wages to increase. Pharmaceutical companies and private prisons don't want drugs to be legalized. Military contractors don't want wars to end. So nothing changes, even though most of the country wants it to change. So should money be given the same treatment as speech? That is the question, of course. Not does money equal speech, but rather should money equal speech? Well, as nice as it would be to let freedom reign for money spent on campaigns, it's just not practical in a democracy. If there are no restrictions on the money, the democratic process becomes compromised, and the government does not represent the majority of its citizens. At the end of the day, this idea, this argument, this premise is ultimately ironic. If it's allowed, the executive branch, the judicial branch, and the legislative branch don't represent the majority of the population. Hence, they don't answer to the majority of the population. Hence, the right to speech, protest, and assembly would be rendered fairly useless.
The premise of democracy is that people are intelligent and can discern the true from the false, at least when as the campaign laws require, you know who is speaking. You can't speak anonymously. You have to say, identify the people that are.
But we don't know
giving
who's speaking in right now.
You know the organization that's speaking.
Not necessarily. I mean, they don't have to, don't need to go into the details, but in some of this way this money is being raised, we will never know.
You may not know who contributes to the organization. You know the organization that's speaking.
So that's all you need to know. You don't need to know that they're hiding behind their.
Well, the press can find out, who's hiding behind what.
But that's
not hard, or you can tell from. Anyway, look at the premise is freedom of speech. The more speech, the better.
God.